I'd like to go ahead and introduce David Klahr. He's the Executive Director of Financial Planning and Analysis and Project Manager for the Taxi of Tomorrow project at the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission. The Taxi and Limousine Commission is responsible for the regulation and licensing of almost 200,000 Medallion taxi cabs for hire vehicles, their drivers, and the businesses that support them. It's recognized as the largest and most active taxi and limousine regulatory body in the United States. He holds an MPA from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and a BA from Hampshire College. Taxi of Tomorrow is an unprecedented partnership between a local government and a major automobile company to manufacture a custom vehicle specifically for use with New York City's over 13,000 Medallion taxi cabs. An open worldwide competition was held to choose a partner to provide the vehicle over a 10-year period. New York City's partnership with its selected partner, Nissan North America, includes a commitment to pilot the use of electric vehicles as taxis beginning in late 2012. The New York City official taxi cab vehicle, the NV200, will be Nissan's second plug-in electric vehicle for sale in North America, opening the potential for an all-electric taxi cab fleet. Building on New York's program, the NV200 will also be adapted for use as a taxi cab in London and Tokyo and is under consideration for one in Hong Kong. With that, help me welcome David Klahr. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As was said earlier, my name is David Klahr, and I'm here to interrupt your lunch a little bit to tell you about something you probably don't think about too much, which is taxi cabs. New York is very unusual in our use of taxi cabs, and before we talk about kind of electric vehicles and what we're going to do with that, it's helpful to understand a little bit of background about who we are, why we use cabs in this way, and kind of the background on this project. I'm always happy to go anywhere and talk to anyone about Taxi of Tomorrow. I was delighted to find out you wanted to hear about it in Colorado, so thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate it, and let's go through this and figure out, can a taxi change a city? And I'm hoping the answer is yes, otherwise this is kind of a wasted trip. So a little bit about New York. Just by show of hands, how many of you have been to New York? A lot of you, great, okay. So we have 8.2 million citizens. That is city limits, not metro area. Metro area is another 10 million people. So that's the equivalent of everyone in Colorado, plus everyone in Utah, plus everyone in Wyoming in 300 square miles, a third of which is water. So I know there's a lot of talk in environmental circles, and there's even some displays outside that the answer is get everyone into high-density housing. I got some good news and some bad news. It solves your car dependency problem, and then you have a whole new set of problems to deal with, which I'm going to talk about today. We had 50 million tourists last year. The mayor was very excited. For the first time ever, we beat Disney World as the most visited destination in the United States. We were very excited. And since this is Colorado, I did a little research. The highest point in New York City is 410 feet above sea level. I can summit it, but with oxygen. So if there's only one slide that you remember from my presentation, this is the most important one. Half of New York City households have 0 cars. In Fort Collins and in Loveland, the percentage of car-free households is about the same. It's 5%. You're actually a little bit below the national average here. Most other communities that are kind of more traditionally composed is in the 7 to 8% range. So you do have a lot of cars here. In just Manhattan, so just the central business district on the island of Manhattan, 77% of households have 0 cars. So why do we use taxis? It's our car share program. They're a car substitute. If you need to go to the grocery store, you need to take your kid to school in the morning, sometimes you go to the airport, sometimes it's closing time, but for the most part, it's an everyday workhorse vehicle that people use to get around the city quickly when maybe the other forms of public transportation aren't that convenient. And I say other forms of transportation for a reason, is that we consider ourselves a public transportation provider. So we're a little bit unusual when you talk to traditional public transit people. If it's not government run, it kind of doesn't count. We don't feel that way. We don't run any of the service. I am a pure regulator. So my job is to tell private business people how to run their business. So as you can imagine, I'm a very popular guy in New York. So the #1 transit system in the country, no surprises, also the New York bus and subway system. Average weekday passenger trips, 11 million per day. We don't quite reach that level. We would be, if we were a separate agency, the 6th largest in the country. So we'd be a little smaller than Boston, a little bit bigger than Philly. All the vehicles we regulate, so it's not just Medallion taxis, but all the vehicles we regulate works out to 1.2 million passengers per day. We don't see a lot of seasonal variation. Doesn't really matter what time of year. It doesn't really matter what day of the week, because all the people who aren't commuting on the weekend, the tourists make up for it. So it's always about a little over 1 million. Just again, regional comparison, Denver is about 300,000 per day, which is actually very, very good for cities of that size. So you have a very strong public transportation network here. So Medallion taxis in New York are very, very weird. Let's go over some kind of basic info so we can kind of continue the conversation. It's a fixed closed entry system. I'm not going to go too much into the history today, but what you need to know is that you need to buy a permit from the city, which we call a medallion because it's a piece of metal about this big. It's made of aluminum. We call it the tin. It costs $10 to actually affix it to your car, but the actual license you get costs $1 million. Yeah, we say the same thing. We also are kind of a little freaked out by it. So there's a tremendous amount of equity in the system because the number is currently fixed at 13,237 vehicles. They don't all hit the road all at the same time. Usually there's about 11,500 on the road at any given time, and there's a little bit of variation on time of day. 3, 4 in the morning, even New York, people aren't really going out that much. You'll see maybe 2,000 or 3,000 on the street. Weekday, rush hour, 11,000, 12,000 at any given time. There's 3 ways cars get on the road. I'll go into a little more detail on these later, but basically 1/3 of the people own their own medallions and own the cars. Another 1/3 of the people lease vehicles on an ad hoc basis. And the other 1/3, they own a car, but they lease a medallion from someone else. And this will become apparent why this is important a little bit later. So the way you buy a medallion is, there's really only one way. You have to buy from an existing permit holder. So they're fully transferable. They are property, just like buying or selling a house. People get mortgages, 20-year mortgage at 5%. That's how you buy a medallion. So depending on how much equity you have in the medallion, it kind of influences how you run your business. So the taxis are on the road 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when I say on the road, I mean they're actually running. We estimate about 22 to 23 hours per day. The only time the car is off is shift change, the guy's taking a restroom break, he's eating or praying. That's pretty much it. So the average taxi goes about 70,000 miles per year. That's kind of the average, and that takes into account a lot of guys who don't work that much. I like to use 100,000 as a nice round number, and it's kind of a little closer to what I'm actually seeing in the field. So the cars retire, actually. They have a fixed lifespan. We're the only jurisdiction in the country where it's mandatory to put a brand new vehicle into service. In most other places in the country, even in very large cities like Chicago, you buy a used car and then you put it on the road as a taxi. It's a car at the end of its lifespan. In New York, we actually have a law that says if the car has more than 250 miles on it, you cannot put it into service. Some owners recently ran into a problem. They bought some cars in Ohio and drove them to New York, and they aged their own cars out, delivering them to themselves. Yeah. We gave them a waiver because we were like, that's ridiculous, but that's the rule. Half the cars are hybrid right now, and I'll go into a little more detail on that. 2% of them are wheelchair accessible, and these are ramped conversion vehicles. We do have a small number of custom-built vehicles. Vehicle Production Group, which is a firm based in Indiana, makes a custom vehicle called the MV1, specifically designed for passengers who use wheelchairs. That's been approved for service, and we have 5 of them right now cruising around the city. The rest of the wheelchair accessible vehicles are conversions, usually Toyota Sienna vans. So we have a couple of peculiar rules in New York. One of them is that it is street hail only. It's the only place in the country you cannot call for a taxi cab. That's a whole separate class of vehicles that we regulate separately. They do about as many rides per day. They also do about 600,000 passengers per day. So that's kind of the other half of the industry. It's much looser regulations. But in New York City, the way you get a cab, and many of you have experienced this, is you step out in the street and you go like this. We call that street hail. And that's all a medallion is. It's a permit to street hail. Now you can pick up people waving you on the street. Anyone who doesn't do that, we have a fleet of 5 tow trucks and 150 uniformed sworn peace officers to write your tickets or confiscate your vehicle, which we can then auction off. It's cruel out there in New York. We have very, very strict driver standards compared to other places in the country. You go to taxi school before you get a license from us. It is a 14-day degree. We teach you customer service. sort of. We teach you geography, sort of. And then we test you for English proficiency at the end of the course. As you can tell from the description, this is run by private entities that we license. We're thinking really hard about a better way to do this because the flaws are kind of apparent. We also require the drivers to have basic proficiency in English. We don't expect them to write essays or anything. You just need to really have enough English to kind of understand your interaction with the passenger. And so what's interesting is in the other industries we regulate, there is no language requirement. And so why do we require people to speak English as a New York City cabbie? It's because of street hail. The car you get is random. If you're calling for service, you will call the provider that speaks your languages. We have many, many people in New York who speak languages as their primary language other than English. And Spanish is the least of it. We have many, many, many languages. We don't have any issue with if you speak Polish, you call the provider that speaks Polish. Everyone's happy. But then if you speak only English, you call the English provider. In a Medallion taxi cab, it's random who shows up. So he has to speak some English because chances are you speak English. There are about 500,000 rides per day in our system, which works out to, we estimate, about 600,000 people per day. The average ride is actually less than 2 people. It's like 1.4 people. For the most part, you ride alone in a taxi cab. It's the frequent turnover that makes it a shared experience, which is an interesting thing. The average fare is about $11, not including a tip. Average tip is about 20% of that. So if you total up all the fares and all the taxi rides for an entire year, you get $2 billion. So it's a substantial enough industry to attract some attention and investment. And the average trip is only about 3 miles, which for us is a pretty long distance, actually. Manhattan's only about 10 miles long. So that actually works out to a pretty, if it's shorter than that, you'll walk or bike or go on your scooter or something like that. Cab is for kind of like that intermediate ride. So what are people driving today? What kinds of cars? Because it's an environmental conference. Let's talk about vehicles. So half the fleet is regular conventional fuel cars, and the other half is hybrids. And of the 13,237 cars, we have 24 different models that are currently approved for service, which next year we'll have 1 model approved for service, which is going to be a big transition. So the really interesting thing is that Ford has about 80% of this market. And of that 80%, about half are the Ford Crown Victoria. And I know you all know what this car is. If you've ever been pulled over by the police anywhere in the country, you've experienced the Ford Crown Victoria. Just an idle question, who rides in the back of a Ford Crown Victoria? Do you care if he's comfortable? I'll get back to that in a minute. Think about that. A full third of the vehicles are a Ford Escape Hybrid. So when hybrids were first approved in 2005, that's the vehicle that the industry gravitated towards. There's a couple reasons why they did that. One of the reasons is inertia. They already had a relationship with Ford dealers. So you kind of go with the guy you know. And the other reason is it was one of the cheaper hybrids. So more about that in a minute. So here's the million-dollar question, Ford Crown Victoria. So our data shows that this vehicle has a sticker fuel economy rating of 16 city, and all of our driving is city. There are no freeways on the island of Manhattan where 98% of our taxi rides happen. It's all city driving. So 16 is sticker, that's not what they get. They get 11 miles per gallon. So remember what I told you a minute ago. They drive 100,000 miles a year, and they get 11 miles to the gallon. Why would they do that? Any guesses? Passenger comfort? Have you ridden in the back of one of these? Okay, that's not it. One more guess. Price. Price is part of it. The real answer is the guy buying the car is not the guy who pays for the gas. And it's really as simple as that. When you're not paying for fuel, you don't care what the fuel economy is. Okay? Simple idea, but it has bigger repercussions. So the way the taxi industry works in New York is everyone wants to own a Medallion, but nobody actually wants to drive it. So for the most part, cabs are leased to people. And the way it works is, you guys will love this, you pay them up front for the lease, and then anything you make above that is yours to keep. So if I wanted to lease a taxi cab tonight to drive in New York, I give the guy $100, he hands me the keys to the car, and then the first $100 is just to pay myself back. I only make money if I do more business than that. And I pay for all the fuel I use. It's a tough business. Like I said before, about a third of the market are people who actually, they own the car and own the Medallion. So these are small business people. They're their own boss. They keep all the overhead, all the profits. They do pretty well for themselves. Another third are what we call DOVs, a DOV, driver-owned vehicle. This is the guy, I lease a Medallion from someone else, but I pick my own car. I bought a car. And then another third are this seems like a crowd that's over the age of 25. Everybody remember the old TV show Taxi with Danny DeVito? Okay, so you know how the other third works. It's a fleet. You go into the garage and you say, give me a car tonight. And the guy gives you a car tonight. And maybe you work that day, maybe you don't. It's a pretty flexible job. So those are kind of the three ways the car gets on the road. But what's interesting is the way it works out is 2 out of 3 Medallion owners don't operate their own car. It's someone else's issue to deal with. And that has a lot of effects on what vehicles people choose and how service is provided. So as I said before, a lot of the Medallion owners, they just don't pay for fuel. Fuel is more than half of the operating cost of the taxi, even for the hybrids. It's a very substantial part of the business that they're in. So we found some really interesting things, is that we have a lot of data. We collect a tremendous amount of data, trip data, vehicle purchase data. We have our own proprietary, we're actually the only jurisdiction in the country that does this. One of the few in the world that does this is that we have a requirement to inspect each of the Medallion taxi cab vehicles 3 times per year, and we have our own facility and our own staff. We have about 85 people who work for us who do nothing but vehicle inspections for like a full 8-hour shift every day. We do about 350 inspections a day, 5 days a week. I describe it as the world's biggest Jiffy Lube. That's kind of what it looks like. We are the largest DMV inspection facility in New York State by far. And so we got a lot of vehicle data, and what we found was if you pay for the gas and you're choosing the vehicle, there is a 0% chance you're going to buy a Crown Vic. It just doesn't happen. They all buy hybrids. So interesting information. And here's the really kind of kickoff to what we're going to talk about with sustainability and taxi of tomorrow and kind of how we arrived at what we're doing now. The taxi industry sued us to prevent us from making them buy hybrids, and they won. Here's the taxi industry. I'm not going to go through who all these people are because luckily you don't have to meet them and you don't have to worry about it. Every single one of these groups, and you'll notice there's a lot of them, have lawyers and lobbyists and other people who come and meet with us all the time to tell us what they like and don't like about being regulated. Like I said, if the Medallion's worth $1 million, they have a lot of skin in the game. They care a lot about what we tell them what to do because we set the fares and we set the maximum lease rates. There's a lot of money on the table at stake, and how it's divvied up is also under the control of the government. So all of these groups, and they represent different types of owners. Some are fleets, some just lease out medallions to other people. People who sell taxi equipment, people who finance taxi medallions, people who advocate for certain types of passengers. All these people have interest groups, except for one really important constituency has no interest group representing it: passengers. There is no official passenger voice for the 1.2 million people a day who ride in our vehicles. So the government, Taxi and Limousine Commission, which is an arm of the city, my boss's boss's boss is the mayor of New York, has to represent the passenger. So something really interesting happened a couple of years ago, which is that Ford decided to stop making the Crown Victoria. One of the reasons they decided to stop doing it is that it's the very latest, greatest technology from 1979. So it's pretty out of date. It's a body-on-frame car. They just don't make it like that anymore. It works great for the taxi industry, but we knew it was going away, and it had an even larger percentage of market share at the time. So the question for us as a regulator was, what's going to replace it? And it turns out that the taxi industry is kind of not so good at long-term planning. We asked them, what are you going to do when the car goes away? And they said, well, we'll worry about that when it happens. We want to make sure all those people who want vehicles get into vehicles. So we weren't happy with that answer. We decided to be a little more proactive. So one of the first things we looked at is what's wrong with current taxi vehicles, right? They're not perfect. There's some problems. So problem number one is it's not actually designed for the duty cycle we put it through. It's running 24 hours a day on some pretty rough roads. Those of you who've been to New York may have noticed our roads are not quite as smooth as yours. There's potholes, there's uneven pavement, there's flooding, there's metal jutting out, there's always construction going on. These cars are not designed to be taxis. They're cop cars, or they're just regular passenger sedans. You know, they're supposed to go like 20,000 miles a year. You know, it's not right for what it is. There's no amenities for passengers. There's not like a lot of thought put into how comfortable the person in the back of the car is. And those of you who've been on really long road trips in the back of a car have noticed it's way more uncomfortable in the back than in the front. And the reason for that is that in the United States, most passenger trips are 1 or 2 people. There's usually not a third or fourth person in the back. The car's not designed for the rear person, except unless you buy like a Lincoln Town Car or a Maybach or something, or Rolls, or something where the assumption is that the important person sits in the back. For us as taxi regulators, the important person sits in the back. this is the really interesting thing, safety. So the term we use is called hacking up, and that's how you take a regular passenger car and you make it a taxi. So it's the law in New York, all taxis have to be yellow. It's really orangey yellow, it's school bus yellow. So you paint it yellow, and then you have to put all this stuff in it. We also have what's called, we call it a partition in the East. In the West, it's usually called a shield. They call it that in Canada as well. There's a barrier between the driver and the passenger for safety reasons, to prevent assaults on drivers. What happens when the car rolls over with the partition in it? We don't know. No one's ever tested it. We think that's a problem. There's also a meter bolted to the dashboard. Does the driver hit his head on that in a rollover or a crash? We don't know. That could also be a problem. There's no amenities for people with disabilities, and at the TLC we take the most expansive view of disabilities that we can. This is more than just wheelchairs. There's a lot of people in New York who fit into kind of a more gray area of disability. You have a general mobility impairment, but you don't rely on a wheelchair. The best example I can think of is someone with MS, for example. Maybe they can walk with a walker or a cane, or they use a chair part of the time, but they still have to get into this sedan, and it's very difficult for people to do that. People with hearing impairments, people with vision impairments, senior citizens, these people all need to be served by these public vehicles, and there aren't any accommodations. Every bus in New York City is a kneeling bus with a ramp. It's 100% wheelchair accessible. We don't have that with taxis. And finally, it's a symbol of the city. When you're watching a movie shot in Vancouver, how do you know they're trying to tell you it's New York City? There's a yellow cab in the shot. Right? It's a universal symbol of the city, just like the double-decker bus is for London, or the cable car is for San Francisco. It's our symbol, and we have 24 different models running around. There isn't a coherent look. This bothers a lot of people. So what we decided to do is the best approach is we figured we're a big enough market to convince an auto manufacturer to give us something custom built just for us. This is something that's been talked about for decades, and the assumption was no one would ever do this. And the reason no one would ever do this is the market is actually not that big. I mentioned earlier that vehicles retire after a fixed period of time. So it's depending on what kind of owner you are, 3 years or 5 years. So as you cycle through, they don't all retire on the same schedule. So the actual turnover per year is about 2,500 to 3,000 vehicles. If you're Ford and you sell 3 million vehicles in the US last year, do you care about 3,000 cars? It's probably not a good deal for you. So I'll tell you how we solve that problem in a slide or two. I like to build suspense, work with me. So we set some minimum standards for what we wanted in this partner. So question number one is, who's qualified to do this? And we decided that only original equipment manufacturers, OEMs, are qualified to do this. We weren't really interested in hypotheticals, right? You could be the most brilliant theorist in the world and you can give us the best design in the world, but if you can't actually build it and deliver it to the city in a reasonable amount of time, we weren't really interested in talking to you. We have practical needs. People have to ride in cars. So issue number one is safety. Mandatory that you must safety test your vehicle to meet federal standards with all the taxi stuff in the car. No one has ever done this, ever, before. We're the first. Has to be comfortable for drivers and passengers. Both groups need to be comfortable. It needs to be affordable for vehicle owners. Right? We have mandate power. I can force you to buy a car. The easy way out is to say, I don't care how much it costs. Then you can get whatever you want in it. That is not realistic for the industry. There's issues of equity and fairness and kind of government overreach. But aside from that, it doesn't work with the economics of the industry. You can't shove a $100,000 car into like a $30,000 hole. It doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, the whole thing collapses in on itself. We wanted minimum impact on the environment. Remember, we're replacing cars that get 11 miles to the gallon and are gigantic. For us, space is a tremendous issue. The actual physical footprint of the vehicle makes a difference in the amount of public space we have because we cannot expand our roads. That's it, we're full. We're a maturely developed city. There's nowhere else to go. So if the space that's not being used for a car can be used for a pedestrian or a bicycle, it can be used for something else. We wanted something that was small on the outside then, but as big as possible on the inside. As accessible as possible to people with disabilities, and something that's better looking than what we have now, something that says New York. So we had a bunch of problems to solve to get to that point. No one's ever done this before, so we had to make up solutions. And some of the problems we were able to anticipate and some we didn't. Now we're at the point where we're getting ready to launch the actual vehicle. I actually drove one about a month ago, which was pretty exciting on the Nissan test track outside Phoenix. So it's a very tangible thing to me, but The hypotheticals, what do we deal with? And one of the real questions is, how do you build this kind of public-private partnership that nobody's ever done before? Cities usually don't partner with automobile manufacturers. That doesn't go together, right? You know, cities partner with information technology providers, waste disposal companies, energy providers, right? That makes sense, but a car company is a little weird. So the first thing we had to figure out is, how do you convince someone that 3,000 vehicles a year actually won't affect their bottom line negatively? I mean, we're realists. No private company is ever going to do anything in partnership with the government that loses them money, at least not if they know what they're doing, right? So the change had to be more than selling the cars. It couldn't just be an exercise in saying, we'll give you access to this market and you'll sell a couple of cars. We had to figure out what the value added was. And what we figured out was, and it was a theory, and I'm glad to say the theory worked out, we figured the city had marketing value, right? New York is a brand, and it's a really popular brand. Remember the 50 million tourists I mentioned earlier? People think New York is cool, and they want to be associated with it. And New York also has a little bit of a reputation as kind of a tough place. So if you had a car that ran 24 hours a day in New York, and everybody there used it, slamming the doors 50 times a day, you could advertise that car as really durable, and people would probably believe you. So the question was, what's that worth? Now we know the answer. It's exactly how much is Nissan's willing to spend on the program, which is in the tens of the millions of dollars. I can't tell you exactly how much, but it's in the tens of millions of dollars. So we had to add economic value from somewhere else to get someone interested in this. And change has to persist. One of the kind of temptations of government is to say, well, we solved the problem in this administration, and oh, there's a change in party or there's a change in administration. Oh, well, what are you going to do? This is really important to us. This is something that really affects the transportation network of the city. People rely on this every day. We wanted to make sure that when the mayor leaves a year from now, the next mayor will be able to continue the program. And also all the various stakeholders that we have to get buy-in from will also persist with the program. The mechanism we're using to make the deal with the partner is a contract. So actually the city is contracting directly with Nissan, and the contract expires in 2030. So over the next 2 decades, people will be riding in these cars, and there's mutual obligations for both the city and the manufacturer. But this is a multi-decade project. How do we ensure that it persists? And a lot of that is the contract, is using that private sector acceptable mechanism to make a deal. They don't have to rely on the promise of an individual politician. They've got it in writing. And it works for us because we have guarantees from them. What happens if the car shows up and it's not so good? Can we get out of this deal? So there's all kinds of deals for us where if someone comes to us, for example, with a much better product at a much lower price, there's a must-compete clause. They have to match it, or we can withdraw from the contract. So there's kind of give and take from both parties. And actually, it was part of the team that negotiated the contract, and it took us about 9 months to do. It was not easy, because no one's ever done it before. One of the other things we had to deal with was that design really influences service. So one of the handicaps we had to overcome was when you talk to people in New York about design, and New York is a very strong design community, they think it means making the thing look pretty, right? It's the thing that comes in at the end, that, okay, you did everything you needed to do, and now we'll make it look nice, and that's totally irrelevant. And it turns out that's not really the case. The way you design the taxi influences how taxi service is delivered. Okay? This is really important. I'm going to say it one more time. The way the vehicle is designed influences how the service is delivered. The totality of your experience as a passenger is your interaction with the designed environment. There's nothing else happening in the back of the car except your interaction with the designed environment. And if something is not convenient for you, or if it's not comfortable, or it's put together in a way that doesn't make sense, you have a bad experience. So function follows form. And it's not something that governments usually think about in this way. If you're building a bridge or a freeway or an airport, you spend a lot of time thinking about this because this is a big project that's going to last forever, and it reflects on your community, and you want everyone to love it. And if you buy buses, you put stickers on the buses with the name of your city on the side. You don't ask for a bus that has a certain look to identify it with your community. People don't really do this, but we wanted to do that with the taxi. And by doing that, design leaders were able to help us make the case for change. For example, there's a founding document of this project called Roads Forward. I actually brought it on my memory stick if anyone wants a copy in PDF. It's also downloadable. Find me afterwards if you want to read it. And it's a book about how does the taxi industry work and how does design influence this. So it's kind of like our Bible to get started about how should we start thinking about this project. So the designers, and New York is actually home to a branch of the Smithsonian, that's the National Design Museum. They contributed to this project as well. What should this vehicle be? What should the experience be? It's more than just how it looks. So we also have to fulfill our sustainability mission. Mayor Bloomberg is a strong supporter of sustainability efforts. We have a citywide sustainability plan called Plan NYC. But legally, I can't mandate fuel economy or fuel choice. So let's talk a little bit about the lawsuit. So one of the major trade groups sued us. They said, you are preempted by the Federal Clean Air Act. Municipalities cannot set emission standards. We lost, and we lost the appeal. I have bad news for you. Federal law. You guys can't do it either. However, I brought copies of the court case in case anybody here would like to take a look and tell us how we're wrong. We would love to hear how we're wrong. It seems like there's a bunch of smart people in the room who deal with these issues. So here's my problem. I want to improve the environment of the city. I want to improve fuel economy, but I can't tell you how much mileage you should get in your car. Tough problem. Remember I mentioned earlier 50% of the vehicle operating cost is fuel? What I can say is, give me the lowest total operating cost. Interesting. But I can't force people to buy a hybrid. Straight up can't do it. And I can't force people to buy an electric car. Illegal. They'll go to court that day and get an injunction, no problem. The other issue I have is that I'm not an environmental agency. I'm a transportation agency. So there's a service component here. And sometimes we have to make tough choices. For example, the car we picked is pretty heavy because it has a lot of goodies for passengers in it. That stuff adds weight. Weight and fuel economy, direct relationship. Sometimes you have to sacrifice one to get the other. And it's a tough choice to make, and it's not easy. The same thing with accessibility. You can have a fuel-efficient car, or you can have a wheelchair accessibility car. Pick one. How do I bridge that gap? We're still struggling with both these issues today. We've come up with a solution we think works for everybody, but a lot of people are mad at us. And finally, New York's a little weird. I will freely admit that New York is a strange place. It's not like the rest of the country in many different ways, and a lot of it has to do with population density really influences how a lot of other things happen. So it's not so easy for us to borrow solutions from elsewhere, and that applies internationally. I can't just go to London and say, or Tokyo and say, well, what do you do? I'll just do that. They're not like us. It's not exactly the same. We feel very strongly we need a solution that really matches what our specific needs are. We leverage our brand to kind of talk to people about that solution. And I mentioned the industry sued us. I think there's 4 or 5 lawsuits from the same group of people currently pending against us. I've actually lost count. It's a very litigious group of guys. They get really angry with us when we try and regulate them. They don't think it's legit for some strange reason. They don't like it. They have a lot of money because they own very valuable property. And they have a very deep investment in the way things are done now. They didn't kind of deliberately pick this process. They didn't hold an open competition to find the best car. It's not something that would have really occurred to them. They kind of look at what's out there, and they pick what's best. So we started this particular iteration of this project on this timeline. We actually left off, the stuff from the 60s from designers about the perfect taxi and how it should work because nothing ever happened. In 2007, what we did was we got all the different stakeholders together, and we considered 3 large groups the stakeholders. We have owners, the people who have to buy the car, drivers, the people who have to operate the car, and passengers, the people who ride in the car. And that covers, 99% of the industry. And then there's all kinds of associated businesses that come with it that I won't get into too much detail. And we got them all together and we asked them, if we were designing a car from scratch, what would you like to see? The other thing we did, which I think was a pretty smart move, and it's worked out really well for us, is I am not an engineer. I don't have an automotive background, so why am I picking the car? We hired a consultant. And what we did was, I think, interesting and unique in that usually when governments hire a consultant, it's to outsource something, right? I don't want to run this anymore. You run it, let's privatize it. You kind of take care of it and do it. We did not want to do that. We did not want to outsource this process because nobody understands this industry better than we do. We have all the data. But we needed someone to advise us in 2 ways. One was to kind of help advise us on what the realistic trade-offs and choices were. Right, to help us really understand what are the real trade-offs we have to work with. And number 2 is a translator. I don't speak Detroit, and Detroit doesn't speak government. They just don't. It's just 2 different worlds. It's not bad, it's just the nature of business. So their job is to get in the middle. So when I say, I want this, that, and the other thing, they say to me, no car company will ever do that. That makes no economic sense, and it makes no engineering sense. And I go, okay, I understand. When the car company says, well, I want the city to mandate this and that and to force everybody to do this, they say, yeah, the politics on that are impossible in New York City. Let me explain to you who the different stakeholders are and how they interact with each other. So that translation between the two groups is really important. And they helped us design the whole process. They helped us with the request for information. They helped us write the request for proposals. They helped us make the selection of the partner. They help us evaluate the development of the vehicle. They're going to help us launch the vehicle. They are a continuous partner throughout the process. We hired a firm called Ricardo. They have a Detroit office. We're very, very happy with the choice we made in bringing this partner in. So in 2007, we did those things. It took us about 2 years to release a request for proposals. This was a procurement. We received 7 responses, of which 3 we decided were the most credible. And the 3 most credible proposals were Ford, Nissan North America, and a company called Karsan, which is a contract manufacturer for other larger manufacturers based in Turkey. So most of you are probably not familiar with Karsan, although university town, you never know. Anybody here ever ride in a Karsan? Anybody ride in a Hyundai in Turkey or Romania? You've never, yes, you've ridden in a Karsan-built vehicle. There you go. See, university town. So we had 3 finalist candidates that we said, of all the people that could do this, these are the most credible proposals. And the way we scored it, 50% of your score was, how good is your car proposal, right? How cool is this? Like, what amenities are you going to offer? How interesting is it? The other 50% was, can you actually build it? Right? Half your score was, have you ever done this before? We're a pretty big city. It's a pretty big transportation system. I don't want to hinge my whole backup transit network on a guy who's never built a car before. This seems like the thing you don't want to do your first time out. This is kind of complicated. So we did multiple interviews. It took about a year to score this. We had them bring in model vehicles. We met with some very, very senior people at the executive VP, CEO level to talk about this project. And then because we're the government, after we did all that, we then went to them and said, now tell me your better offer. So that was the fun part, is to say, okay, now give me a better offer. So after we did all that, we scored, and Nissan was the highest scoring, the highest fuel economy, and the lowest cost. So it was the clear winner. The interesting thing we did is, and people who deal with procurement or city managers, usually when you're procuring something, you want to go with what's cheapest. We wanted to go with what was the best. We were okay with a car that cost a little more money to get better quality. Very unusual for government. So the scoring was not, it was modified by the price. It was not dictated by the price. Once we picked Nissan, we had a public expo to kind of show people what we're getting. We kind of corralled off a public park. So one branch of the government called another branch of the government, the Parks Department, to say, can I borrow a park? I get to do stuff like that? The answer was, sure, of course. So we had it at Madison Square Park, which is a pretty big park in kind of the middle of the island. It was at the New York Auto Show this April. Every April is the New York Auto Show. It was not touchable. You couldn't sit in it. The upcoming New York Auto Show in 2013, you will be able to sit in it and touch it. And it launches exactly a year from now. Next Halloween is the official launch date for this vehicle. It's the West. I have to ask the libertarian argument. Why not just let the market decide? It's a legitimate question that I think deserves a real answer, right? Why not just let people choose? These business people know how to run their businesses. They know better than you. They know what their needs are. Just let them do what they need to do and it'll all work itself out. And the response I have to that is, we tried that already. We tried that already. 24 different models of vehicles. Everything you can possibly think of is already approved for use as a taxi cab. Hybrid, non-hybrid, luxury car, compact car. They're all available. But they all gravitated to 1 or 2 vehicles, and that tells us something interesting. We also know that when we let the market choose, passengers and drivers get completely left out. Because remember, the guy buying the car doesn't buy the gas. But the guy operating the car should have a say in what kind of car it is. It's his livelihood too. So we already know that if we kind of let it to the market, a lot of people get excluded. It's a serious externality in this free market. We also knew that a manufacturer would never come in and do this deal with us unless we can offer them an exclusive. 3,000 cars is bad enough. To say to them, well, we'll just let people pick. They already know that everyone will just go with the cheapest car. And if their car is $50 more, no one will buy it, even if it's a much superior vehicle. That wasn't acceptable to any manufacturers. They all told us the same thing in the request for information period. We need an exclusive deal or we're not doing this. So that was a compromise we made. We also know that the taxi industry likes to rely on economies of scale. They all gravitate towards one car. In the 60s, it was the Checker Marathon. Everybody remember Checkers? Yeah, checkers. Big car. I've actually sat in one recently. They're not as good as you remember. After that, Chevy commanded the market, and then in the late 90s is when the Ford Crown Vic came in. So what happens is they all gravitate to one car because there's tremendous wear and tear on these cars. So when you go to a garage, you want to swap out parts, right? You keep a car graveyard in the back, and you swap out parts to keep your cars living and running. And everybody needs the same car because they trade parts with each other. If you're a fleet and you operate 4 different cars, you have to have 4 different parts inventories. That's not very efficient. Any operations research people here? No? Okay, so they're not dumb. They know how this stuff works. And finally, as I mentioned a couple of times before, the city has a lot of leeway in kind of negotiating on behalf of the entire industry. So everyone here knows what a monopoly is, right? Right? Does anyone know what a monopsony is? So a monopoly is one seller. A monopsony is one buyer. Well, I'm a monopsony. I approve one vehicle for service through my government power. I can now negotiate on behalf of 13,237 owners. Collectively, they can't get together and do that, but I can negotiate on their behalf to get the lowest price, to get the most amenities, and to get guarantees in a contract that protect them. They can't do that on their own. They've never been able to do that on their own. So we thought that was a pretty good benefit. So it's an environmental conference. Let's ask the environmental question. Why don't just let everybody drive hybrids? That seems to solve the problem, right? It's much more efficient than a gas car. Well, one of the things that we learned through our partnership with Ricardo is that hybrids are being phased out. It's one of many, many technologies that car companies are going to use to meet future mileage targets. So wedding ourselves to a particular technology is probably not the best practice. There's bigger and better things coming, and we should get ready for that, and that includes plug-in electric vehicles. Hybrids do solve a lot of our environmental issues, but they don't solve the other issues that I mentioned we care about. Safety, comfort, service, accessibility. They don't solve that problem. We have that pesky federal law problem where I can't mandate them, so I kind of have to let people figure it out on their own. And we did learn something interesting. We do have one very important data point. So we approved hybrids on a voluntary basis in 2005. Vehicles turn over every 3 to 5 years, so it's been 7 years. Every single vehicle has now turned over, and 50% of them are not hybrids. And that tells us that no matter what incentive we throw at the problem, half the industry just won't buy them. They won't do it. Whether it's cultural or it makes more business sense to them, they're just not going to do it. So we're never going to get to that 100% hybrid saturation point where you really see those tremendous benefits. And finally, since we picked Nissan as a partner, we get kind of a fun benefit in that they're already selling electric vehicles. It's not a hypothetical for them. You guys can buy a Leaf right now, no problem. It's just available in New York. It was available in Colorado. You guys got it way first for a variety of reasons, most of them having to do with weather. New York is one of the hardest markets in the country because our weather is really bad for electric plug-in vehicles. So we were much more intrigued with the idea of kind of leapfrogging hybrids and going straight to plug-in electrics because we thought that had a lot of better longer-term potential. So we went from kind of buying something off the rack, kind of existing vehicles that don't exactly meet our needs, to having an influence in how they're designed, a place at the design table. Here's some pictures of it. Sorry, I probably should have brought more pictures. That's the fun part. The upper left-hand side is the partition image. You'll notice there's a TV screen in it. All New York City taxis now have these interactive screens in them to display information and a live map. You can also pay by credit card through that system. There's air conditioning vents. There's separate climate control. There's all these fun goodies I'll tell you about in a minute. On the right, you can see the legroom. I'm 5'10". I can sit in the seat and fully cross my legs and not touch any part of the partition. There's a lot of room in these vehicles. On the lower left, that's an actual show car driving around the city before New York Auto Show. You can see what it looks like. It's a minivan type platform. It's actually smaller than a conventional minivan. But if you want all these amenities and comfort, you can't put that in a traditional sedan. It doesn't fit. And then on the right, you can see the luggage capacity. So these vehicles are 2 feet shorter than the Crown Victoria, but they have more luggage space and much more passenger space. So we got what we wanted out of that. When I was at the Nissan test track, they have a room there with all kinds of luggage that you can shove in the car to see if it fits. So you guys will be really happy to know we put in a full hockey bag, 2 sets of skis, and an unfolded stroller in the trunk, and they all fit at the same time. Car is ready for Colorado. Okay, so what are some of these unique features we get out of this partnership? What are the goodies? So for us, number one is the safety testing with the partition, all the taxi equipment installed. As a regulator, safety's got to be our first priority. We believe this will be the safest taxi ever made, and we're really happy about that. Let me give an example. Rear passenger airbags. So there's a wall in the back. What happens to the airbags if you have a wall in the back blocking the airbags? No airbag for you, right? Well, the manufacturer in this case is installing the partition. Usually it's aftermarket. You get the car and then you go to an aftermarket provider. Well, since the engineer designing the car is the same guy who's designing the partition, no problem for the airbags. They're designed around the equipment. Seems like a small thing, but to us it's a big deal if you're in a crash. Passengers and drivers have separate climate control systems. It's 2 separate zones. What is the number one fight between New York City taxi drivers and New York City taxi passengers? When you ask the passengers, they won't take me to Brooklyn. But if you ask the drivers, it's a fight over climate control. One of those people is in the car 12 hours a day. One of those people is in the car 3 minutes a day. Who has the legal right to control the temperature? The guy in the car 3 minutes a day. It's a problem. It has a transparent roof. When people come to Colorado and they get off the plane, what's the first thing they want to see? Mountains. When people get off the plane in New York, what's the first thing they want to see? Skyscrapers. We're a vertical city. We want people to look at it. It's part of the experience, right? Tourists are about 20 to 35% of the total taxi market. We consider them an important stakeholder. Sliding passenger doors. What is the number one cause of bicyclist injury in New York City? Dooring incidents. Dooring. It is really hard to door someone with a sliding door. If you can figure out how to do it, let me know, because I can't figure it out. We have a pretty strong cyclist advocacy group in New York City. They had one request for the vehicle, and that was a sliding door, and I'm happy to say we were able to fulfill that request. It actually worked in the vehicle for other reasons, but it's a nice net benefit to have that as well. Has a deployable step and grab handles, so you don't have to kind of pivot yourself to get in. You just kind of step into a big, wide, flat area. That's really different than existing vehicles. Customized seating materials. New York is icky. People spill things in the back of cabs. There's bodily fluids involved sometimes. It gets kind of gross back there. You need to be able to just wipe it down and go on to the next passenger. But here's an example of aftermarket problems. What if you bring a car seat? Could happen. We have to put a vinyl covering over the seat to make it wipeable, because standard car seats, right, the bench seat that comes in from Ford is not designed for an environment where 50 different people sitting in it a day. So there's an aftermarket solution. Nissan can give us something that's just as cleanable as vinyl, made of recycled materials, much more environmentally friendly, doesn't outgas, and cleans just as easily as vinyl. Sold. Oh, and it costs the same to the end user. Car costs the same. Sounds great. The driver's seat has a completely different fabric that's more breathable. Again, one person's in the seat for 3 minutes, one person's in the seat for 12 hours. Passenger reading lights, passenger charge ports, and floor lighting. What is the number one complaint phoned into the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission? Lost property. What is the number one kind of lost property? Phones. What's the number 2? Umbrellas. Good crowd. So what's the environmental impact from this project where I can't mandate fuel economy? The good news is there's still a good net benefit. We're going to raise fleet-wide fuel economy from 24 miles per gallon, which is where it is today, with 50% hybrids, to 28 miles per gallon when Taxi of Tomorrow is fully implemented and commands the entire taxi fleet. We have a net increase, a measurable, substantial net increase. It's worth doing. That works out to 5.5 million gallons of gas per year saved. That seems like a big number. And it actually works out, it's a raise for drivers. They make $23 million more than they would have by driving the other vehicles. We also, because it's a city procurement, had to do an environmental impact statement, just like any other big city project. And what we found was, compared to the status quo fleet today, which again is half hybrid, versus the future fleet, there is no net environmental change. So we're not tremendously better off from where we were before, but we're not any worse off either. We're able to bring up general fuel economy, bring down carbon emissions using a high efficiency gasoline engine rather than a hybrid solution. We're able to do it completely legal. Theoretically, we'll survive a court challenge. We'll see in the next year. But the long-term goal is zero emissions. We're pretty interested in this idea of a plug-in electric vehicle. We have a very robust electrical infrastructure. So we have a full commitment by Nissan. It's mandatory for them to pilot the Leaf as a taxi cab. So the deal is we get 6 free Leafs to use as taxis and 3 free charging stations that we can put anywhere we want, which is harder than it sounds. New York Taxi is probably the roughest duty cycle you could probably think of for an electric vehicle. Why? Number one, the vehicle has to run 24 hours per day. You can't put it on a charger for 8 hours. Even a level 3 charger is a little too slow for most of the taxi industry. Problem number two, the car needs to go 250 miles on a single charge. We're not there yet. We just aren't. Will we be by decade's end? Probably. Based on what we're seeing, yes, but we're not there yet. The weather, a lot of precipitation, a lot of humidity, extreme cold, extreme heat, sometimes in the same day, gets kind of nasty. Big effect on batteries. Air conditioning has to blast all summer. August weather in New York City, 89 degrees, 97% humidity. Very rough on an electric vehicle. Are we there yet? We don't know. We're about to find out. Will we be there in the next few years? Definitely. The good news is that the platform we chose as our taxi, the NV200, will be Nissan's second electric vehicle in North America. That's a definite. So when we're ready for it, it'll be there for us, which is good. We don't have to convert something else. It's already the car we know and already the car we have a relationship with. We know the Leaf is not going to work as a taxi, right? Anybody here riding a Leaf? No? You should. It's awesome. Tremendous pickup. But the back is really cramped, like really cramped. It's not good for taxi cab use. So this is an infrastructure test. This is to test how does the duty cycle work with the vehicle? How do the chargers work? Is this something that this industry can actually adopt in a reasonable way? The answer might be no. We're prepared for that. We think the answer is yes, but we really have to test the proof of concept before we're willing to commit to this. And we have charging problems, and I will describe our charging problems by describing where I park my car. I own a car. I don't live in Manhattan. I own a car. I live in a 6-story apartment building with 90 apartments. There is street parking sort of near my building, but there's no guarantee I get a spot within 4 or 5 blocks of my building. Problem number one, I live on the 4th floor. I can't run an extension cord from my house down to the street if I get a parking space in front of the building. Okay, so I can't do it that way. Problem number two, okay, put in electric chargers on the street. Well, there's no guarantee I'll get that spot, and there's no guarantee I can have that spot for the 8 hours. We encourage parking turnover in New York. Limited space, a lot of people, right? So I can't do that. So how do I park my car? Like most people in New York, I rent a garage space. Okay, it costs me a couple $100s a month to rent a garage space. It's 5 blocks away in a separate building that I don't live in. And it's valet. I don't have a designated parking spot. The way I park my car is I pull into the garage, I leave the keys in the ignition, and I walk away. How do I charge my car? When we can figure out how I can charge my car, we will have solved the electric charging problem for taxis. Because 2/3 of the owners have exactly the same problem I have. Remember I said this would come back later? So remember, 1/3 of the cars are fleets. They go to garages to do shift changes. We know how they're going to charge their cars. They're going to put in a row of level 3 chargers along the wall, and we'll designate like the charging hour when demand for rides is at its lowest, like 2:30 to 3 in the morning. They'll just plug in the cars, charge them up for half an hour to 40 minutes. They'll be ready to go. Easy peasy, no problem. For the Dove drivers, for the owner drivers, that's their personal car. If you were to come to my Costco on a Saturday morning, you would see the lot filled with cabs. It's not people hailing the cabs. The guy just needed to go to Costco, and that's his car. He can only afford one car. It's New York, it's expensive. He doesn't have a driveway. He parks it on the street. Where does he charge his car? One proposal that we got was find a battery switching place. Has anyone heard of a Better Place as an electric vehicle provider? It's a different model of electric vehicles where you basically drive into a facility that kind of looks like a big car wash. A robot comes underneath your car, mechanically swaps out the battery, puts in a fresh battery, and then you drive away. So there's no charging period. The batteries are continually charging. So we looked at this solution. There's several problems with it. One is that there's no vehicle cleared for use in the United States that's suitable for use with this technology. Kind of a big deal, but maybe it'll change in the next couple of years. And then there's the New York cost issues. Remember I said we have specific problems. Manhattan has very few gas stations, but 98% of cab rides happen in Manhattan. We're actually one of the few places in the country where airport runs are not a significant portion of our cab business. It's only about 2%. Okay, so you want to build a gas station in Manhattan. How much does that cost? Land alone is probably $2 to $3 million. Then you have to build the building, add another $1 million for that. Now you need enough batteries for 13,237 cabs. So we did some math on that. We figured every cab would need 3 batteries. You need 2 charging and 1 that's swappable. it's $100 million just to buy the batteries. It's a pretty significant capital investment. I don't have that kind of money available to me. My entire agency's budget is $40 million, and there's 500 people working there. We don't have that kind of money to throw around. Private investors don't have that kind of money to throw around either. So one of the questions that we also got was, in terms of emissions, was why don't you look at alternative fuels? So LPG, illegal in New York City under the fire code. You're not even allowed to transport it through the city. It's considered a safety risk and a terrorism risk. Can't do it. Compressed natural gas. We actually piloted this in the 90s and it was not successful. And the reason it was not successful was the problem I just described, the gas station problem. There were no CNG fueling stations in Manhattan. Converting an existing gas station would be prohibitively expensive because of legacy infrastructure costs. And if you put the gas station anywhere else, they can't fuel up in a reasonable amount of time. Drivers just wouldn't do it. They would not drive over a bridge and pay a toll to go get gas. We had one proposal for that, to put it in New Jersey. So you pay a toll to go to New Jersey, and then you have to come back just to get gas. No one's going to do that. That's not realistic. So we did look at these options, but for our particular market, they seemed less doable. It seemed like less hurdles to do electric because we're already wired pretty heavily for electric. So we feel like we're a leader in this, that New York is kind of setting the global standard for taxi cabs. No one else has ever really done a project like this. Other cities are starting to adopt our project. London, which is kind of the other great taxi cab town, basically is copying our approach. They said, yeah, we want one of those. It's being modified for their use, but they take our vehicle. They take our design and our vehicle. It's definitely going to be used in Tokyo as well. So like the song says, if I can make it there, I'll make it anywhere. We like to think that other people will adopt our approach. We put a lot of effort and thought into this, and we're happy to share the information with anyone else. There's no restrictions on Nissan to sell this vehicle anywhere else. There's certain aesthetic elements that are just specifically for New York, but they are free to sell the vehicle anywhere else they want, anywhere in the world. So I realize I went on for a while, but thank you very much for your patience. I hope you got something out of it. Back in the, let's say as late as the 60s, you could call for a cab or street hail a cab. Certain things changed in the city in the late 1960s. Cabs stopped going to boroughs other than Manhattan, and so to fill that gap, what started, they used to call them gypsy cabs, we refer to them as for-hire vehicles today. People just fill the gap. If there's market demand for something, someone's going to sell it to them. So what happened was the Medallion taxis kind of niched themselves to do the specific service. So when the city decided to legitimize these kind of quasi-legal cabs, the deal at the time in the mid-'80s that was struck between the two industries was, if you handle the other boroughs, you're by phone, and you don't go to Manhattan, and you just do phone service. If you do Manhattan, you do street hail only. There's no real policy reason it was done that way. That was the political deal that was struck. So, okay. Thank you very much, everybody.